Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the first of 2 lectures covering pinniped evolution. Before we actually get into the evolution of pinnipeds, we're first going to take a look at some other concepts associated with evolution and creating evolutionary trees. And the concepts are going to be homology and the sticky property known as convergent evolution. So let's actually start with those topics. Now, cladistics, which is the branch of biology that deals with making evolutionary trees, assumes that when you have shared derived characters, they are going to be the result of the same ancestor. In other words, if you have an elephant seal and a walrus that both have a thick blubber layer, we are assuming that they are shared derived. They're shared, but they're also derived from the same ancestor. And so we say that such shared derived characters are homologous, which means that they arose from the same ancestor, descended from the same ancestor. So homologous structures actually means they are similar because they share a common ancestor. The alternative hypothesis would be that a walrus developed a thick blubber layer and an elephant seal developed a thick blubber layer, but completely independently of each other, not because they share a similar ancestor that had previously developed a thick blubber layer that then they evolved from. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to this same example that we used in the previous lecture, and we're going to take a look at how homology is put into effect in the production of a cladogram, or an evolutionary tree. So in our previous example, what we had done is we had taken a look at the pinnipeds, and the pinnipeds are broken down into 3 families. We have our true seals, which are known as the phocids. We have our fur seals and our sea lions, which are known as the otariids. And then we have the walrus, which is the sole surviving member of a larger family known as Odebanidae. So it's a big long word to say, but we just say it's the walrus. Okay, so what we have here is we're basically going back to this character matrix that we created for them in the previous lecture. And in that character matrix, we basically looked for shared derived traits. So for example, on this character matrix, you might notice that the lacrimal bone is absent in all 3 families. It's absent for the true seals, it's absent for the fur seals or sea lions or the otariids, and of course it's absent for the walrus. So the assumption that we make is that there was a previous ancestor to all 3 of those families that had lost their lacrimal bone, and the lacrimal bone is just a bone in humans anyway that is found right here along that tear duct. So that's where the lacrimal bone is found. It's right up here. And in these animals, it's no longer there. That bone is completely gone. So we make the assumption that if all 3 of them have lost their lacrimal bone, they have done so because they are homologous structures. Similarly, when we have true seals and walruses sharing a thick blubber layer, we make the assumption that they do so because they arose from a common ancestor that also had a thick blubber layer. And these assumptions, therefore, are noted in our cladogram, or our evolutionary tree that we created for these 3 families. So if you notice here in the tree, we actually take a look at the character loss of lacrimal bone. We put it way down there, which says it happened one time in evolution, and therefore all descendants, which include the otariids, the phocids, and the walrus, also have lost that lacrimal bone. And again, if we didn't make this assumption, if we didn't say that there was a loss of lacrimal bone being a homologous structure, then what we would have to say instead would be that the otariids lose a lacrimal bone, the phocids lose a lacrimal bone, and the walruses lose a lacrimal bone all independently. And so normally that's not the assumption that's made for cladistics. So why are we bringing this up? We're bringing this up because it's not always true. Even though it's a nice premise, it's not always true that similar characters or character states are the result of homology. In other words, that they descended from a common ancestor. The alternative is something called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution basically states this: if you have distantly related taxa or organisms, for example, a whale and a fish, they may have similar characters, not because they evolved together, but because the constraints of the environment force them to adopt similar body plans or similar character states. So for example, for animals that can swim, which include marine mammals, we tend to see a very streamlined body. Now, tuna and sharks and whales are totally different taxa. They're not anywhere close to each other on the evolutionary tree, yet they all look very similar in body plan because they all do the same thing in the environment. Therefore, natural selection has shaped them to have a streamlined body with very strong appendages to help them move quickly. So that is convergent evolution. Well, how do you know if convergent evolution is what's going on versus homology, which is what we assume? Well, that's actually a tricky question, and it has a tricky answer. You don't always know. What we try to do is we try to use other pieces of evidence to our best ability to determine if two similar character states are the result of homology or the result of convergent evolution. All right. Unfortunately, within the marine mammals, convergent evolution is rampant. In other words, even when you take a look at diverse taxa within the marine mammals, such as the cetaceans, the sirenians, and then the pinnipeds, we see a lot of examples of convergent evolution, even though whales, manatees, and seals evolved completely independently of each other. And so similarities are the result of this convergent evolution. So what I want you guys to do now is to take a good look at this picture. I have a whale, a manatee, and a sea lion up, and I want you to look for similarities that you see compared to terrestrial mammals. In other words, these all look much more similar to each other than any one of them does to a terrestrial mammal. And these are going to be examples of convergent evolution. So if you were to stare at this picture long enough, you could probably come up with 5 or 6 different ways that these are all similar from terrestrial mammals, even though they evolved independently because they were emerging into an aquatic environment. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that you might have seen. The body plan example is the most obvious. For example, you tend to see a very streamlined body. You have a reduction of lanky limbs. So for example, a human, we have lanky limbs here. Marine mammals don't need that. It gets in the way. And so you see a reduction of those lanky limbs. We already talked about in an earlier lecture how being large is advantageous in that cold environment. So as a rule, pretty much marine mammals tend to be larger than terrestrial counterparts. And of course, they all have limbs that are modified for propulsion. Although they may not have the exact same limb, you can see here in the bottom picture, the whale and the manatee tend to have the same hind flipper shape despite having evolved independently. And some other ones that you might not have noticed from the pictures are that they all have some mechanism to thermoregulate that tends to be similar, such as being a large size. A lot of them have thick blubber layers. Whales and phocids, for example, both have thick blubber layers, despite the fact that they're not evolutionarily related to each other, and they have countercurrent heat exchange mechanisms, which will be saved for a later lecture. And then another feature that a lot of them share is apnea. Apnea is called breath holding. So if you hold your breath for an extended period of time, that is apnea. And they all have pronounced apnea despite having evolved that character state independently. So because convergent evolution is so rampant within the marine mammals in particular, it makes it particularly difficult to come up with an evolutionary hypothesis for marine mammals, particularly some of the groups, because you never know if you're looking at a character state and it's the result of convergent evolution or homology. Okay, so before we move on and actually start looking at the pinnipeds, I want to stress this fact. If you assume homology when what you're really looking at are the result of convergent evolution, you've just made a big mistake, because now you're taking two lineages and you're saying they're evolutionarily related to each other, despite the fact that in reality, they're not. So that's the big pitfall. You have to know, when are character states homologous versus when are they the result of convergent evolution? You might ask yourself, well, how could we know that? And we try to use all the available data to us, and that includes the fossil record. The more robust the fossil record, the less likely you are to make a mistake between homology and convergent evolution. Unfortunately, many marine mammals die in the ocean, which means recovering their fossil records is rather difficult. Also, we use molecular data, and then we use detailed morphology. So we try to use all the tools available to us to help us understand whether or not a trait is homologous or the result of convergent evolution. So now we're going to actually see a tale of homology versus convergent evolution that basically spreads over 100 years. The earliest pinniped biologists had already begun to construct a theory about their evolution as early as the late 1800s, and all the way up until the 1960s, and then of course even up until today, that picture of how pinnipeds have evolved keeps changing. In other words, what is currently thought to be the correct model keeps changing. And one of the problems with establishing pinniped evolution is whether or not some of the character states are homologous or convergent. It's not always clear. All right, so before we actually look at the two major hypotheses that have been put forward for pinniped evolution, I first need to define some terms for you. So when we take a look at evolutionary patterns, we can break them up into, let's just say, 3 groups. One hypothesis is that the group in question, in this case it would be the pinnipeds, are monophyletic. That is, they evolved from one ancestor. The word mono means one. Another says they are diphyletic, which means they evolved from 2 ancestors. And the third says they evolved from more than 2 ancestors, many ancestors, and that is polyphyletic. In other words, the group in question may not be evolutionarily related at all. We've just grouped them together out of convenience, despite the fact that they have no evolutionary commonality among them. And that would be an example of a polyphyletic group. So among the pinnipeds, of which there are 3 groups, there have emerged 2 major hypotheses. The first one is a monophyletic hypothesis that basically says the phocids, the otariids, and the walrus are all related, and they all stem from one common ancestor. Now on this picture here, I want you guys to see this little bit right here. Where my arrow is circling is the node that basically says one ancestor, 3 branches. Notice I don't have the branches arranged in any way here. I'm simply saying one ancestor, and they all evolved from that one ancestor. The alternative hypothesis that was first proposed as early as the 1950s and 1960s is the diphyletic hypothesis. Now remember, diphyly means 2 ancestors. And in this hypothesis, it's basically purported that the otariids had evolved from the bears. And of course, just when you first look at them, you can kind of maybe get that, because remember, bears have ear flaps, and so do otariids. It's one of their defining features. And that phocids evolved from a weasel-like ancestor instead. In other words, when you take a look at the grouping here, you notice that the otariids and the phocids do not share a common point. And so they are considered to be diphyletic, evolving from multiple ancestors, or 2 ancestors. The walruses remain in question in this hypothesis. Certain people have put them in different places. So we're going to leave the walruses out of this for right now. And what we're going to do in the next part of this lecture is start looking at what molecular data, what morphological data, and what the fossil record has to say about both of these hypotheses, to see if we can come to some agreement about which one is probably the most accurate. And with that, I'll see you next time.